Hello, my name is Cassandra Zweigert, and this is my Module 9 case study for AEP 855 Educational Leadership. So to summarize the case, it is a complex encounter between Mr. Inman, the principal, when he calls James in to discuss his recent tardies. James is known to be a troublemaker, and Mr. Inman has spent much time building a relationship with him. As James is headed to the principal's office, his teacher witnesses him giving something to David, a small kid that does not have any history of troublemaking. Mr. Inman decides to call David to the office as well. Somewhat of an interrogation pursues with Mr. Inman, James, David, and the school police officer. David refuses to answer questions concerning the exchange in the hallway. He acts suspicious and nervous. Upon searching David, the officer finds brass knuckles. Due to the zero-tolerance weapon policy, David is cuffed and escorted out, despite the protests of James. At this point, Mr. Inman is faced with an ethical dilemma. David is a good kid that was bullied into holding brass knuckles for James, a boy that is often in trouble. James confesses that the knuckles are his, and he forced David to hold them. Now David is facing felony charges and maximum discipline, and his parents are not happy about it. David's future will be compromised by this one incident. Mr. Inman does not ethically feel the situation was handled properly, therefore he decides not to write James up, and in turn, faces his own write-up that will be added to his personnel file. So, who is involved? Mr. Richard Inman, the principal, James, the troublemaker, David, the honor student, the campus police officer, the teacher who witnessed it, the exchange, the parents of both boys, the alternative education program, the director, and the board members. This happened at Rocket Junior High in the hallway, and then later in the principal's office. It happened during 5th period and the days that follow. There are some legal and ethical issues to consider. Was anyone harmed in the action of this or decision of this? Yes. The reputation of James and his attempts to straighten up. He was trying to make his life better, and his reputation may be ruined. David's reputation, his academics, and his future dreams. David's parents are upset, and Mr. Inman will get written up if he follows through with his decision to not write up David. Does the action or situation contravene an existing law or policy? Yes, there is a zero-tolerance policy for weapons of any kind in the school. There are state and federal laws that prohibit weapons in school, and there are anti-bullying laws and policies. Was there a breach of contract? Yes. Mr. Inman is in breach of contract by not writing David up and referring him to the alternative education program. There were also actions of discrimination and maybe harassment, because Mr. Inman could be accused of discriminating against James by writing him up and not David. And the other way around, if he does write both boys up, then he could be accused of not upholding the anti-bullying policies. So the ethical issue is protect the students versus school policy. So what exactly happened? Mr. Inman is faced with an ethical dilemma. If he does not complete the paperwork showing that David had a weapon in school, he will face reprimand. If he does complete the paperwork, he will send David to the alternative education program, negatively altering his life course. So the people involved, as I stated earlier, are Mr. Inman, James, David, the officer, the director of secondary education, and the parents and students of both boys. It takes place at Rocket Junior High in the hallway and principal's office, and it also is noted that there are a significant number of students that travel to school from the harsher South Side that maybe have more trauma and more need more discipline issues. Have more discipline issues. The programs are, this is a public school. David is in the honors program, and then there's the district alternative education program that they will go to if they're expelled. So to review, there is some damage to some of the stakeholders. David and his parents will suffer if he gets expelled. Mr. Inman, if he doesn't do the paperwork, he will get written up, and that will go in his file. And then just the question of what kind of example is this showing to other students and other staff if Mr. Inman wants to model ethical behavior. Either way, what kind of example is it showing? And then James finally made big strides in admitting fault and doing what was right, and then he still gets the same sort of punishment, so there is some damage done. Who is concerned with the outcome? All the stakeholders: James, David, Mr. Inman, the director, the officer, the parents of the boys, and the parents of the other students as well. Have all stakeholders been consulted? No. James' parents could have been consulted, and then maybe even policymakers or board members. Can I learn more about this situation? Of course. I would go back and thoroughly read the policy, both the anti-bullying policy and the zero tolerance weapon policy. Who made this policy? Was it at a local level, a state level? How did it come about? Why was it made? And is there an ethics committee that can review this situation? Do I know enough to make a decision? Yeah. Legally, I know enough. Ethically, that decision is not quite as easy to make. So there are 3 possible options that I came up with that would work. One is to do nothing, to not write David up. James would be expelled and have to go to the alternative education program. David would be free of all disciplinary action, and Mr. Inman would be written up. They could follow the zero tolerance policy, where both students are expelled and have to go to the alternate education program for 45 days. Or Mr. Inman could attempt to change the policy, and this is going to take much time and energy. There are pros and cons of each. By taking no action, some positives are that David will have no disciplinary action. He will be able to go on as he has been. Mr. Inman will retain his relationship with David's parents, and Mr. Inman's will model ethical behavior and personal conduct within the school. Cons would be Mr. Inman will be written up, and he will face discrimination charges by not giving each boy the same punishment, and the students will see inconsistencies in Mr. Inman and the policy. As far as the zero policy, if Mr. Inman chooses to send both of them to the alternate education program, Mr. Inman is not written up. Mr. Inman maintains his current job status, and the current rule stands, and there's nothing that needs to be considered further. The negatives of this, the cons, are that both boys face disciplinary action, and relationships are lost. Relationships with David and James and the parents and maybe even other students. David's reputation is ruined his future as far as academics, and he'll have a felony, and Mr. Inman is not modeling great ethical behavior at this point. He's just following policies. If he pushes to change the policy, some pros would be some open communication and maybe some change within the school. David will possibly retain his reputation, and Mr. Inman will maintain parent relationship, and it models ethical behavior and personal conduct within the school. Cons would be the board committee and the director may not welcome the change. They may just want Mr. Inman to go along with the policy. Mr. Inman may be seen as a troublemaker, and it may be difficult for him as a first-year teacher to make this change in policy, and it will take much more time, work, emotion. The best option that I can see is that Mr. Inman tries to rewrite the policy. This would be best if, because all options, it will reach a better ending for all of the stakeholders, and all options will be reviewed. This option will be positive for most stakeholders. It allows and promotes open communication between everybody. And then by communicating with the board, committee, the school security, and the director, Mr. Inman will be able to fully assess the situation as a team. They will use communication skills. They'll be able to advocate for the students, to build respect from between their colleagues, and will prove that Mr. Inman will not shy away from ethical and legal situations that need attention, nor will he simply follow the rules without hesitation. He will advocate and stick up for his students. To implement this, option 3, the change in policy, we will definitely have to begin by defining the problem in which the policy is not fair in this case. Then research other policies, look at how other schools' policies are written and how they would handle this situation. Set up meetings between the stakeholders, the school administration, director, policymakers, board, etc. And then fully explain the situation to all of those stakeholders involved. That this is not simply a legal issue, it is also an ethical problem. And then clear away any hearsay that might have occurred between the time of the incident and currently. And then make amendments to the current policy, giving administration discretion when needed. What could happen if if everybody else decides that it's okay, then the policy will be changed and everybody David will probably get his no disciplinary action, and James will get what he deserves by having the brass knuckles. But Mr. Inman's ideas for change could be rejected. He will not have succeeded in building rapport with his colleagues, and he may be looking for another job after this, and he will still have to deal with the ethical situation if they shoot down the change in policy. So then it becomes then all of this includes Mr. Inman, the director of the secondary education, the administration, the policymakers, the board members, the security staff, James, David, parents, and teachers. This plan involves everybody. It will take good communication. Mr. Inman will need to enter conversations without being threatening. He will need to be assertive, but invite all parties to work together cohesively. Mr. Inman will need to model ethical behavior that he wants to see in the policy change. But what if? What if that gets shot down? What is Plan B? Plan B is do not write up David. Mr. Inman should take the write-up and the following consequences. Moral decisions do not always follow law or policies, and this is a moral decision concerning James and David. James was bullying David, and David felt like he had no choice, so to give him the same punishment as James is immoral. David didn't have any prior discipline problems and should be let off a little easier, not have to go to the alternative education program. This plan can be done more quietly, involving only David, his parents, and the director of secondary education, rather than involving so many parties from the first plan, from Plan A. There are some more considerations that I would like to look into that don't necessarily go with the either plan, but involving the Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, and Big Brothers Big Sisters to help James get more involved and stay out of trouble. Maybe even reassess the bullying policy. It doesn't necessarily go into the zero tolerance weapon policy and this, but it's still part of this ethical decision. Offer team building for staff and students just to build better rapport, and then implement a social and emotional learning curriculum, and consider becoming a trauma-informed school, as this is super important where James has maybe gone through some trauma. Here's some references, and here is my reflection that I will post with this video. Thank you.